Yossi Klein Halevi is a fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem and a contributing editor to the New Republic. He's a commentator on Israeli affairs. His op-eds appear in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other publications. He's the author of At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, A Jew's Search for God with Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land, and he's currently writing a book about Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem in 1967.
Thank you. And as everybody here has said, it really is an honor to be here. And like Einat and Mark, I actually came to know Avi vicariously through an intern. And in my case, it was Benji Davis, the guy who has the largest number of Facebook people in the world. And it was through Benji that I came to know something of the extraordinary gift that Avi has left all of us. So thank you. Thank you for having me. I'd like to focus on the role of Jews in the BDS movement and in delegitimizing Israel. Daphna mentioned it briefly in terms of, I think the term you used was giving a hechsher, a kosher certificate to the BDS movement, asserting that the BDS movement can't possibly be anti-Semitic if Jews and even some Israelis are involved. I once asked the French Jewish philosopher Alain Finkielkraut, who's played an extraordinarily important role in resisting the delegitimization of Israel in France, how he explains the fact that European non-Jewish intellectuals don't have a moment of shame or even self-questioning in terms of their adoption of anti-Zionism. How is it that European intellectuals don't ask themselves the simple question of why is it the Jews again? And his answer was very simple. The defense against their own squeamishness is provided by the anti-Zionist Jews. And he was speaking about anti-Zionist Jews in France, but that is true, of course, in North America as well. Now, there are some anti-Zionist Jews who can be characterized very comfortably as self-haters. Norman Finkelstein, I just learned a new name, and now I've forgotten it, so let's leave it at that. And there are those who are so clearly psychologically damaged that explains their involvement in BDS. But I would guess that most Jews involved in BDS are not self-haters. And in fact, some who are involved might actually be acting from what they believe as a positive Jewish identity. And by that I mean that for some Jews, and not only Jews on the right, but also Jews on the left, the Holocaust is the center point of their Jewish identity. And we know the ways in which the Holocaust identity has distorted part of the Jewish right. I think we need to start confronting the ways in which it is distorting part of the Jewish left in terms of an obsessive identification of the Jews with victimization. And Israel, of course, threatens the core of that Jewish identity. And there is a deep rage among some Jews toward Israel for depriving them of what was the center point of their positive Jewish identity, which was the Shoah, which was the pride that they took in being part of the fellowship of victims. And the turning point, of course, was 1967, although at the time, those of us who were conscious and alive and influenced by 1967 didn't realize the damaging consequences of denying Jews the identity of victim. The 1960s was also the time when victimization became a positive in Western culture. It's the first time in history that I can think of that a culture would identify being a victim as being a good, something to aspire to. And Israel has deprived those Jews, for whom victimization was the center of their identity, of their core. Now, obviously, not all those involved in BDS are anti-Semites, not only the Jews, but also some of the non-Jews involved. Nevertheless, all those involved in BDS are complicit in what we can call an anti-Semitic moment. BDS represents the return of classical anti-Semitism in the following way. Anti-Semitism is the tendency of a given civilization to identify the Jew with whatever that civilization defines as its most loathsome qualities. And whether that is Christ killer under Christianity, murderer of prophets under Islam, and that was a way in which Jews were referred to, capitalist under communism, race polluter under Nazism, and now in our time, in the era of globalizing human rights, the Jew as the arch violator of human rights. Now, we have a problem in calling this anti-Semitism. The problem isn't that it is. The problem is how useful is it to define this as anti-Semitism. And we are really, frankly, in a kind of trap here, because I believe profoundly that this is the latest phase of anti-Semitism, and yet the enemies of the Jewish people have preempted us in identifying it as anti-Semitism by saying, well, of course you will accuse all criticism of being anti-Semitism. So we need to be very careful in how we use this weapon. Nevertheless, I think that in terms of how we deal with fellow Jews on campus, whether it's faculty or students, the essential anti-Semitic nature of BDS needs to be clear in our own internal Jewish conversation. The brilliance of anti-Zionism is that it has restored respectability to anti-Semitism after the Shoah. And it did so by turning the Shoah against itself and by identifying the Jews with the Nazis. And in so doing, anti-Zionism has, in a sense, corrected the aberration of Nazism in the history of anti-Semitism. Because Nazism was blatantly evil. It celebrated evil. It hated the Jews in the name of evil. And it made an ideology out of evil. Whereas classical anti-Semitism has always appropriated the good to itself. Think of classical Christian anti-Semitism. We despise the Jews because they oppose the redemption of humanity, because they are the block to redemption. So that what is happening today is really a restoration of good old-fashioned anti-Semitism, which was temporarily given a bad name by Nazism. Now, what defines delegitimization of Israel? And many of us are grappling with trying to make those the proper distinction. And for me, the distinction is between attacking the consequences of 1967, which is not only not delegitimization, but a very legitimate part of our own internal Jewish discourse, versus attacking the consequences of 1948, which of course means denying the existence and the reality of Israel. Now, what is at stake here? And with this, I'll conclude. As much or more than any other people, the Jews are defined by their story. We are the story that we tell ourselves. The secret of Jewish survival has been our ability to transmit our story and to maintain the vitality of that story from generation to generation. And so what is being attacked today is the core of our ability to survive in the long term. The Jewish story of the 20th century, to my mind, is the greatest Jewish story since the Exodus. It is the story of the capacity of the Jewish people to transform its worst nightmare into its greatest dream. And that is precisely the story that is under assault. And the BDS movement is attempting to poison our story and to undermine our ability to transmit our essence onward. The last point, in Israel there's always a last point. The last point is that, and this is really a generational observation, when I was growing up, the struggle for the diaspora was freeing Soviet Jewry and furthering the ingathering of the exiles. And it was a very clear struggle. The good and the evil were both obvious. In this generation, the struggle, I believe, is no less important for the future of the Jewish people, maybe even more so. And it is infinitely more complicated. And that's why I believe that what we need to do is not only defend our story, which of course is a given, but we need to enhance our own internal conversation, and Einat touched on this, in terms of what our story really means. Why is this story worth defending, and why does this story continually find itself on the front line against the forces of evil in history? Thank you.